guys, what is going on? Revamped here, and welcome back to another Cards and Castles video. Today, we're going to be looking into the Pirate Faction, everything you need to know from the Enchanted Grove update. I know it's been about more than a month since Enchanted Grove released, and I still haven't covered all the factions. But doing it in a methodical way is probably better for the schedule I'm working with right now. So do bear with me if these are coming out, of course, months upon I think a few months, even well, maybe not a few months, but it's definitely going to take some time to get all of them out. I don't think it's going to take several months, but I think that was just a hyperbole or along those lines. So with that being said, let's jump into the pirate faction and see what's changed about them, what's made them better, the strengths, weaknesses, and some of the key cards that you'll be finding high usage in the pirate faction. Let's take a look. So where to start out with the pirate faction? Well, we know from the Reddit post on the expansion, pirates are thieving scoundrels who love treasure and will use any dirty trick they can to win in combat. Pirates have exclusive access to gold generating abilities and are a debuff focused faction. So they do work primarily in ramping and gold gain, if you're not familiar with the term. And I mean, it's kind of obvious based on what they are. They're pirates, they love gold. Bit of an obvious one, like I said, but who doesn't love gold? And they do, of course, we've seen them utilize this gold gaining faction in previous times from things like invest, which is now treasure, and just simply gold gaining like Merchant's Favor does. So they're always going to be related to some sort of goal, and that's what made them a very prominent faction in recent times. Generating a lot of gold for your turn and or the next turn, which you can use to subsequently overpower your opponent, either with various combinations, just stronger units, a total board wipe, and then reinforcing your own board. There's a variety of ways you can use the gold to your advantage, and that's probably why they're one of the stronger factions under Crusaders, though, because Crusaders do have the card draw, which is very valued, and the heals, which again, highly valued, not as much as card draw, but still very hard to come by now that the game has been factionized, so that Crusaders are only going to have that heal. I would say, though, Pirates is a close second, only tying with Warlocks in terms of how high you value direct damage or gold gain. But with that being said, there are, of course, a variety of weaknesses we know that the Pirates do possess. The Pirates are, of course, weaker in their units. I mean, they don't have a lot of units, if you can imagine. I mean, if just by clicking like a scroll unit count, their units are normally, I would say the early game they're kind of weak, and you can see that more towards the late game as well. You got like Assassin at 3-1, Dwarven Sharpshooter at, what was that, 2-3, Voyager, Sea Witch. Now there are exceptions. I think most of the range units you can see have high health, 4 for Troll Gunner, 5 for Cannoneer, but things like 3 for Robins, and they're 10 gold endgame big monster. Their Kraken is only about 5/5, so they're not very powerful in the stat line. I mean, you have some exceptions, of course, like I said, not only with the monsters, but with some earlier units too. You got things like Doomship, but Doomship isn't really prevalent. I struggle to say that word for some reason. And Witch Doctor, but his last will effect can highly cripple you if you use him too early on. So, I mean, that's kind of one of their main weaknesses. I will say, though, that they do make up for it in some other strength, not only the gold game we talked about earlier, but also the debuffs. Now, of course, when we're talking about debuffs, debuffing is just generally a reduction in stat line, either in the health or attack of a unit. I would consider decreasing movement a debuff as well, but I don't think there's a lot of cards anymore that take away some movement. There is freeze, but that is specifically a Viking oriented ability, and usually anything to do with movement can be found in ninjas. So I would think movement is generally kept between Vikings and ninjas, ninjas giving movement, Vikings temporarily taking them away with freeze. But anyway, they do have a lot of debuffs now in the faction, which really help them, I guess, make them competitive in a sense. Probably one of the best example of this debuff that's being competitive is mugging. I do like to use mugging. Not only that 2/2 at 2 gold can be very helpful, not only in the early game, but as we go later on. The treasure is also useful if I want to ramp out into something that I normally would not have access to the next turn. Say if I use mugging on turn 4, I can bring out a Tyrannosaur the following turn, seeing as how I have 6 gold from the treasure. So you see how mugging is a pretty good example of that. We do also have some straight debuffs. No sort of gold gain or anything. I think the best example of that is, I'm trying to find it, just knockout. Not a lot of people use knockout, uh, thanks to it being 4 gold. But that stat line of 3/3 is pretty crippling. And I will mention that if you do debuff a unit's health to where it would drop to 0 or negative, the unit does die. So debuff can partly act as a removal, depending on how weak the unit is and what kind of debuff you're pulling off. But I would say it's not hard removal. It's more like a soft one. Um, if that kind of makes sense. Well, hard or soft. Anyway, not going to get into that sort of debate right now. I know I could probably maybe touch upon that later. I don't know why I just said that. Now I'm getting myself confused in my head. Fantastic. So, with that being said, of course, let's take a look at some of the more prevalent pirate cards within the faction that are probably going to see high play, if not now, then definitely in the near future. And the first card we're actually going to talk about for the pirate faction is actually Merchant's Favor. I didn't mention it in the beginning of the episode or the video, but I feel like Merchant's Favor is sort of like one of those untapped cards. When it did originally have a 0 cost gaining 2 gold, it was pretty valuable. You saw a ton of interesting ramp decks come out of it, but it sort of lost that when it became 1 gold. However, now we have this new version in which Merchant's Favor not only gains 1 gold for the existing turn, but also has Treasure 1, bring it over to the next turn. So it's basically 2 turns of ramp, which I find very interesting for a card. There's not a lot of cards that give that immediate sort of ramp. Well, I mean, you have things like Risky Business that give the immediate ramp and Dwarven Greed that, if you have a dwarf, it takes place. Merchant's Favor is sort of one of those cards that it's sort of decreased in usage for a while, but I think it could slowly come back over time. The 2-turn ramp is definitely more advantageous to you if you can utilize it in sort of ramp specific decks. Maybe, turn 4 you use a Merchant's Favor. Not only do you have 5 gold for this turn, but also 6 gold for the next turn. So it kind of keeps you above the opponent for the next 2 turns in terms of what you're doing with gold. And for 0, gold investment that you're putting in for the card, I'd say it's a pretty good deal. I don't think this card is probably the most powerful, but I did want to touch upon it a little more since I think I sort of briefly mentioned it in the beginning, like I said, of the video, and I felt like it deserved more of an explanation here. So, Merchant's Favors, a very nice change to the card, and I think it could potentially see more play if there are more ramp-focused decks in the future. Speaking of untapped potential, guys, Dwarven Scope. Let me tell you something about this card. Probably one of my all-time favorites coming out of beta testing for the Enchanted Grove. Now, previously this card was probably the shittiest Dwarven based card on the tier list or a part of the Dwarven archetype because it really didn't mean much. However, now it's become something incredible, and I feel like I don't see enough people playing because it's just so good. Dwarven Scope, of course, is now 3 gold, pirate faction, unique so it can't stack, but it gives any unit +1 range and +1 health. That's kind of amazing, in my opinion. You have all these different combo units and units that need to get up close and personal with another to really activate an effect. But now with Dwarven Scope out, as a possibility, you have so many more options. You have so many more possibilities for various combo units now. Rune Warrior, Chain Lightning can now be done where he's at a safe distance. Arcanine General can activate a last will effect from a distance. Flux can bring you more spells. I almost forgot her ability for a second. She can bring you more spells without getting hurt. And not only that, but this +1 health, Flux can be brought up to 5. Arcanine General can be brought up to 7. I'm trying to think of what I just previously named. Rune Warrior can be brought up to 5. Dread Pirate, which we'll get into later, can be brought up to 4 with range. There's a lot of things that can be done with Dwarven Scope, and again, I'm surprised to not see it used more. Um, People are experimenting, of course, in this new day and age with the game. There's a lot of decks out there, a lot of possibilities now with the factionization. But Dwarven Scope is probably one of those untapped potential cards that we could see emerge later on as, I don't want to say, completely broken combinations, but they're going to be very powerful if they do utilize Dwarven Scope. And again, for those of you who do know me, talk to me on Discord, you know that this has probably become my all-time favorite card. I'm trying to use it in nearly every pirate deck I have because it's just so powerful. So Dwarven Scope, really like the change to this one. Very strong card now, and I'm excited to see where we could see it down the road, either in high leveled competition or fun unique combos. Next up, we have Rusty Hooks. Now, Rusty Hooks didn't really get a massive change from the Enchanted Grove, but I feel like I'm putting in more. I have put him in this video to sort of showcase that even though he's kind of declined in use over the last few months, people haven't really been using him since the change, he's still a pretty badass card. His Dragon Force is something unique that we have not, gotten on any other card before. And while its 1-3 stats look weak, that can be easily buffed with things like Fat Bard and Armory going up to a 2-4 or a 3-5 and becoming this, monster range unit. And of course, Rusty Hooks does not have sluggish, unlike range units. So unlike, again, other range units, it has that, variety of just, I can be summoned and I can be used to attack, unlike most range units, of course, now having that sluggish, effect on them. So I think Rusty Hooks is definitely a card that hasn't really gotten much love since TEG launched, and again, sort of like Dwarven Scope, I hope to see it more in the future. I'm trying to incorporate it into a variety of pirate decks that I play nowadays, and I know it can pull off some incredible moves through, in most decks that you can put it into. So, like Dwarven Scope, of course, an untapped potential card, and I hope to see more of it in the near future because it is an incredible card. The +1 range, the drag enemy, the stat line, and the cost. So overall, great Rusty Hooks, and again, hope to see him more in the future. Next up, I move on to the King Crab. Now, of course, the King Crab hasn't really changed a lot since we've, last seen him, but I think he's become pretty powerful since TEG has launched. That being because of his riposte damage. I think I'm saying that wrong. I actually had someone link to me like the correct pronunciation of riposte, and I think I just still pronounced it wrong. I don't know why. It just looks like riposte. I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting a little off track here. King Crab, of course, now a 4/7, has that riposte ability and only moves horizontally. So the only moving horizontally hasn't really changed much, but it's the riposte that really makes him unique in this update. 4/7 doesn't really seem that, well, it kind of seems big for an attacker at 5 gold. Actually somewhere in the middle, I would say, maybe. I'm over on the one end of the spectrum, going to the other. But now, I think he's more in the middle of the spectrum, King Crab. And the reason why I'm highlighting him is because that's not a 4/7 to the enemy. That is an 8/7 thanks to that double damage. And with the stat health of 7, your opponent's not going to directly take out the King Crab with damage spells. I mean, he could, but he'd have to use more than one. Unlike Southport Captain and Fencer, which both have the potential to be hit by a direct damage spell, Disintegrate and Blue Fireball, respectively, just naming 2 off the top of my head. King Crab is going to take more damage than that to kill it. Its 7 health is pretty beefy. I don't think, well, you don't really see that sort of stat line until probably about 6 and up. So King Crab, of course, is that discount at 5 gold. His horizontal movement isn't really a big deal because your opponent will have to answer that directly somehow, depending on if you're moving it close to the castle or not. The only way they could really stop King Crab is if they knock him back to the far top or the far bottom lanes, in which case you've essentially ruined King Crab and you need to sacrifice him right away for fodder. But still a great unit, and that 8/7 stat line is really what I'm emphasizing here, because the riposte is something that hasn't really been touched on. We've seen it with Southport Captain because people have been running him in greed decks, but we haven't really seen Fencer emerge, and we've barely seen King Crab and Monster decks as a whole. And I mean, while Fencer and Captains, just like King Crab, are pretty good with the riposte now, Captain dealing 4 damage on counter, Fencer dealing 6. I think an 8/7 stat line for 5 gold is incredible and definitely scary to the opponent. So maybe start to incorporate King Crab. I know 5 gold is really like an important shift in the game, so you don't maybe want to summon an 8/7, maybe you want to use a buff for a spell. I get it, but for those of you who do want to try it, I highly recommend that you do if you can support King Crab in the deck. His 8/7 may definitely take out or trade with a variety of the opponent's resources. So you'll definitely be getting a card advantage maybe out of him nonetheless. So overall, King Crab, a very solid change with Riposte. Still pronouncing that wrong. But with that being said, we're going to move on to our final card of the day. And yes, the final card we'll be going over today is the Dread Pirate Robins. Now, Robins certainly has seen a decrease in play. It's sort of stabilized now. We see him here and there with some decks, but he was virtually unused for a few years now, thanks to not only the nerf to Merchant's Favor, but his transformation from a ranged unit into a melee unit. So it sort of hindered his play a little bit there. However, now he's got an interesting ability that I think might slingshot him, if not stabilize him, into some competitive play involving ramp decks. So what he has now is gaining treasure 5 on play. That's pretty big. That's probably the biggest treasure currently in the game, unless you start pairing treasure on top of treasure, like say Mercenary Execution with Dragon's Horde, which will give you 5 treasure. But, base-wise, gaining 5 treasure is the biggest, and Robins has it, so that's significant on its own. But Victory Rush of gaining 5 gold for that current turn is pretty cool. If you play Dread Pirate Robins on your turn 7, waste all your gold to summon him, and get a kill, you now have just played a Dragon's Horde, essentially, which I think it's 2 gold. Yeah, so Dragon's Horde's 2 gold. So you get a Dragon's Horde out of it plus 2 gold, so that's of course the 5 gold. But you also have the additional 5 gold from the Victory Rush to work with on your current turn, summoning some extra things for you that you maybe didn't or think you'd bring out this turn. And of course, Robins does have that 5 attack, so he's most likely going to be trading with something on the field, meaning that you can get rid of any sort of enemy unit that you have. So it sort of can control the board on your side and start your own offensive push in a sense. And that's why Dread Pirate Robins, I think, is pretty good. He's got a lot of versatility to him. And I was saying earlier with Dwarven Scope, a very monstrous combination, a 5/4 range that on Victory Rush gains 5 gold for that turn. Again, something that hasn't really been tapped into and I think should be for ramp decks to be very competitive. We've seen sort of green-yellow ramp decks hinder on, like on the edge here and there nowadays with things like red, yellow, good stuff, trap dojo, undead, all sort of emerging and creating problems for greed that originally was able to just squash no problem. So I think Robins can save greed from, falling back into the void that is nothingness. I don't know. I was thinking of a better word for that, but it just didn't come out. But anyway, Robin's definitely a very solid card, and I think his change greatly helped him and Greed as a whole stay a relevant archetype. That being said, guys, that is going to end the video for today. If you guys did enjoy it, please be sure to leave a like, share with your friends, and comment down below either your thoughts on the Pirate faction, what they've become, or if there's something I missed about the Pirate faction that you think I should go into further detail on. Again, please leave it in the comments section below. I do read all the comments. Don't really get a lot, but it's still comments nonetheless. So with that, also, if you are new to the channel, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Show your support to the channel. Help us grow just by clicking that subscribe button. Hopefully, maybe planning on doing some more deck videos coming up in the near future, so stay tuned for that if you aren't already. And of course, Friday we'll be doing another Shadow War stream. Be sure to hop on for that and hang out with a bunch of us on Friday. So with that being said, guys, until next time, stay gaming.